So what we're going to do today is just have a discussion first about the genesis of storytelling and the role played by the imagination in their development. Particularly, Alexis will talk about her own writing, and she did want to stick closely to those two ideas, the genesis of the story and the role of the imagination in developing the story. And then we'll broaden out from that to look at different kinds of stories and different kinds of storytelling. In addition to her two acclaimed novels, Carpentaria and The Swan Book, Alexis is, and before that, Plains of Promise, of course. Alexis has also been involved in collecting stories. First with Grog War, which was a kind of community storytelling project in which Alexis was to some extent the amanuensis, the scribe, the collector of the stories. That was about alcohol, the effects of alcohol in Tennant Creek. And most recently, she has been engaged in an ARC project, gathering stories by and around the Indigenous activist, businessman, politician, Tracker Tillmouth. So that gives you some sense of the range of her conception of storytelling. And a story I like to tell about Alexis is that to some extent she honed her writing skills in the meeting rooms of the Central Land Council and the many meetings that went to put together the two conventions, the Kalkaringi Convention and the
Tennant Creek Convention. Today we talk about tomorrow.
Yeah, today we talk about tomorrow. And they were conventions about, not just about Aboriginal land rights, but about Aboriginal self-government. So her sense of the stories, the role of the stories, the social and political role of the story goes beyond, I think, that simply literary conception of the story and the power of storytelling. Is that correct?
I suppose so.
Yes. I'm still doing my bit. So maybe we'll touch on that as well. But to begin with, I think we're going to talk about the genesis of the story. So do you want to take up from there?
The genesis of the story, in terms of stories that I'm telling? Or?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I think it probably goes back a long way, to many years of being working in the Aboriginal world, Indigenous world in the country. And when I was quite a young woman, and I was often used as, the person, the scribe of writing down stories and of doing the reading and writing, for lots of groups that I was involved with up on around Mount Isa, Aboriginal Legal Service, and a Grog Rehabilitation Centre we had there, a housing society, and I went up to Mornington Island during the time Jalki Peterson was wanting to take over the running of Mornington Island, and which is in the Gulf of Carpentaria, part of my home area. Not Mornington Island itself; it's Lardle country, but the whole region's made up of many Indigenous nations, language groups, and ours, Wanyi, is in the lower highlands at the call of the Gulf of Carpentaria, and so people up there got me to write down stories, and there were a lot of meetings and involved. This is a long time ago, and a lot of protests happening, and from there, I could see the telling of stories. And I suppose it goes back even further to my early upbringing as a child. Particularly spending a lot of time with my grandmother, who was a great storyteller, and I really learnt from her ways of of imagining, because I could only imagine some of the things that she was talking about, the way that she saw life in general. Everything around her was through other things, not just through people, but plants and country and spirits and all kinds of things. And so I learned to, I think that's where I learned to imagine, and from a very early age, and through her care. But then there was all those years of hearing stories, from people, in communities like Mornington Island and places around the Gulf of Carpentaria area, Mount Isa, Cloncurry, and then over in Central Australia, where I spent a lot of years and working.
I just wonder. You just refer to all of those as stories, but what kind of stories were there? I mean, your grandmother's stories, for example, were they small, short stories?
No, it's just the way that she would. Well, they are stories, about things that are in the water, and the constellations in the sky at night, and and things that children hear, Aboriginal children hear, don't do this and don't do that,
Because
there's boogeymans, there's spirits, and then something will get you, and
so they had a strong
and then that's what's a way of restraining. Today, children are restrained by four walls and all sorts of conditions and that, and watchful parents. In the Aboriginal world, kids are running wild, and it's a way of restraining children too. But then there's other stories that are, you get to know about as you get older, that are, important law stories for country, and that about what's alive in the country, what's still in the country, and and having respect for all sorts of things. So you learn about that.
They're more traditional stories. They were traditional.
They're traditional stories. I think. It's quite difficult to understand, but it's and I've talked about this before too. As I studied to try to find out ways of writing, and I was studying, looking at writers from across the world, and someone like Carlos Fuentes, the Mexican writer. He really came clear to me, where he said all times in Mexico are important and no time has ever been resolved. And I found that really resonated with the Aboriginal world, that all times are important, no time has ever been resolved. So you go back to the law stories from the traditional stories that's embedded in how we think and feel and understand. And also the stories of what's happened, to people. So you take all that and it's all embedded into the stories of colonial times and the stories of now. So there's so many stories. They're all resonating in in communities and in the Aboriginal world. So how do you then take all that and try to produce a book? And that's what I was trying to do anyway.
Yes. What I wanted to ask you also is, so the stories you heard at the rehabilitation centre, or when you were collecting stories about alcohol abuse and so on, those stories weren't traditional stories. They were about recent grievances or hurt or tragedy even, is that right?
Yes,
but
yes.
Did they also have a traditional inflection?
Well, they do, because people try to understand it through traditional values and beliefs and understanding. So even if it's a matter of grog, that people try and find understanding of that through a belief system. And even though grog doesn't belong, they'll say grog doesn't belong to us. It belongs to white people. White people brought grog here. And but still, why is that person drunk, and why is that happening? Is he, affected by, some of the spirits in the country,
I see.
Yeah.
And what about family stories? Because Carpentaria is really one big, complex family story. About grievances going back generations.
Yeah, but I'll go back to the grog situation first. Grog book, the Grog War book that I did for Gillala Curry Council in Tennant Creek. They asked me to do that book and to tell a story of their 10-year struggle to try and bring some restrictions to the consumption of grog, the excessive availability of grog in a place like Tennant Creek. The Northern Territory at that time, I'm not too sure what it is at the moment, but had the whole territory had an extraordinary high proportion, rate of the availability of alcohol and consumption compared with anywhere else in the country, and and Aboriginal people and the drinking of Aboriginal people is more public. And where there were a lot of non-Aboriginal people drinking just as much, and they were doing violent things in their homes to their families. But you don't hear about all that. And as much as you do, you've seen the visibility of Aboriginal alcoholism. And not that I'm saying it's any less, it's very high. But, there's a lot of politics in that and a lot of stories associated with that. Not only on our side, of the bargain, but also on, the non-Aboriginal side as well. They invent stories about Aboriginal people as well. So we deal with that. So it becomes a very complex issue. And with that book, it was, a book that was done for, and with the community through Gillala Curry Council in Tennant Creek. And with those stories that people told me there, because, grog and we're made to feel really denigrated as people because of grog, they become very shameful stories. And shame, and there's a lot of shame associated with what's happened to people who've been drinkers or not drinkers anymore, but maybe drinkers again in the future. And so a lot of people would tell me a lot of things that what was happening. I really opened my eyes, and but they didn't want to be identified in the book. They said, "We'll tell you this, but you'll have to make a make-up story or something, but you can't put our name in the book because we still have to live in this community. And if we say something and, someone reads it, in the town camp where we live and, we'll be held responsible for it." And so I had to invent stories in the grog book as well as telling a factual story. And where it was a lot different when I did the book, Tape Power, 20 years of commemorating the first 20 years of land rights in Central Australia, where everybody wanted their name in the book, and everybody wanted their story in the book, and to tell the struggle that they had, the fight that they put up to get their land back. Some years, in some of those land rights cases, it did take 20 years to get their land back, and they were very proud of it. And so it's a very careful thing got to try and do.
In both Carpentaria and the Swan book, there are hilarious accounts of council meetings. People getting up and wanting to tell their own stories and being shouted down and that kind of thing. And also, just to come back to my point about family stories, because both novels feature very largely, family stories with enmities and alliances going back generations. I know there's an overlap between family and community, but surely the family is also an important generator of stories.
The family?
Well, the family
Yes.
and its history.
Yeah, of course.
and so on.
But the family's also related to, other families and,
Yes.
and connected somehow or other to their total community and to the other community next door and further down the track, and then, and relatedness to the country and So everything is related.
So it sounds like you're saying that, from your point of view anyway, the stories always move outwards. They're like ripples in the water. They just keep expanding. Is that
I think
your
so.
sense of the story?
Yeah, yes.
Not just back in time,
No.
as you suggested in the quote from Fuentes, but outwards through the landscape and through space as well.
Yes, yeah, because that's what we would say, that we're related to everything. You know, everything's my cousin, and you know, the air out there is my cousin, you know, or my brother, and so it is.
That would account.
And I don't think the Western construct, you know, of you know, the sort of Norway you see in novel, you know, really suits the Aboriginal story. That's my personal feeling, and that's what I found when I wrote Plains of Promise, for instance. I felt it was very constrained, and I had to find a different way of doing it.
A more capacious
Yeah.
form. But the epic novel is capacious enough. So Carpentaria read quite easily, well, not easily, but you could read it as an epic of the North, and it was read that way. But the Swan Book, which is even wider in its storytelling range, maybe that's less amenable to what you're calling the novel form. Did you feel that with the Swan Book, that it was really pushing out the limits?
Yes and no. It's. I mean, I like to challenge myself, and I think from all the work that I've ever done, and well, I think I've been conditioned that way through you know, life in general. You know, from an early age, and to the kind of work that I've done in my life. It was everything was a challenge. You know, everything we do is a challenge, and you got to be up for it, and otherwise you get run over, and you personally have to be up for it, and so in deciding to write fiction, I just felt it really had to be a challenge for me, otherwise I wouldn't do it. And so each time I'm writing, I'm just trying to push what I can do, and whether it's you know, it's new or anything, it's different. It still gets down to, you know, sitting there every day and trying to do it and trying to push the ideas and the world that you're trying to describe. It's I don't know. It's just you know, some people say to me, "Oh, why don't you just write, you know, a commercial sort of novel and make a lot of money?" And and I say, "Well, why don't you, you know, and give me the money?" But maybe I will try and do something like that one day. But it doesn't seem to come out the way. It seems like what you're trying to do is more important. You know, what I'm trying to do with, you know, some of the ideas that I'm working with, you know, it feels important to me, and it seems urgent. You know, that it has to be, you know, told, and it has to be some sort of I don't know, some sort of mark that's been left there, and say, this is what happened here, and.
What, like opening up new territory, putting the flag down, that kind of thing?
No. It's you know, we're affected by things. You know, for instance, the government does things to us. You know, even now. Well, you can, you know, that comes part of the story, the part of the story of who we are, mixed with everything else, from the all times and the all embracing. And, but it creates a mark, that this is what happened here. And so for instance, the new novel has something to do with, the intervention and the basic card. And so what does the basic card mean to the mighty spirits in the sea,
What is the basic card?
The basic card is something that came from the Northern Territory, intervention, where people, instead of getting a pension, their entitlements, they get a basic card, and you have to go to the store and use your basic card to buy goods and whatever you need. You don't have the money, and it doesn't work. And
electronically, you mean?
Well, it doesn't work because if you want to buy different things, it's very difficult, and it's very difficult if you go to Alice Springs, for instance, where you can use your basic card, and you just don't have the choice anymore, and what and what you might want to use your money for, and anyway, it's so you can connect that. What does the basic card mean to the ancestral spirit, of our country, and means bugger all really, and but that's an attitude too. That's part of that, a makeup of who we are, and it's a survival tactic.
I might come back to the idea of the outer limits, pushing the limits, and go to the beginning. So the germination of the story. It always shocks me when you say that the first idea for the Swan book came in 2003, which is well before the publication of Carpentaria.
2002.
Okay.
No, because I was looking last night, when I couldn't sleep last night because I was looking to an application I did to the Australia Council, for maybe a research grant or something, and that was in 2003. I don't think I got that grant. I don't know if I did get anything from the Australia Council, though we acknowledged them in the Swan book.
No, just for the publication of the book.
All right, okay, that's all right then. That's okay.
But anyway, I was surprised that the germination was there in 2002 or 3, well before the publication of Carpentaria, and 10 years before the final publication of the book. So can you talk about that first idea then?
There were a number of ideas at the time. I even had an attempt to start writing it at that stage, and the book is nowhere. The story is different, totally different, but there's elements in of that early writing and notes, and some of the notes were about wanted it to be about swans and brolgas, and I don't know where the idea of swans came from. I think it might have just been a little newspaper clipping, something I saw in the newspaper about swans, and I thought at the time when we had the John Howard government, we were having a lot of difficulties there. I was still in Central Australia, and I thought, well, did I want to worry about John Howard for the rest of, the next 10 years, or worry about something, or worry about swans? And I keep saying that I chose swans instead of John Howard, and good thing too, because I would have gone mad, and madder, and so I did a lot of research on swans that grew to that. But there was swans there. There was a bough of a eucalyptus tree there, and with tangled vines of decades of bush banana vine on through this. But the bush banana vines didn't make it into the novel, I thought. That's a pity.
The roots did, though.
And wilting October cabbages, I didn't get there.
They didn't get there either.
No.
I don't remember that.
And, but there were just little snippets of images and ideas. There was, there was going to be an Aboriginal Prime Minister, and that became, the Warren Finch, who became the President of Australia, as a federation, and there was also the mute girl.
So what about her?
And who'd been. There were issues around that time as well about arranged marriages in the Aboriginal world and how terrible all that was, and you get all these sensational sort of newspaper reportage about young girls being forced to marry old men and blah blah, and there was also the issue about petrol sniffing, and I'd seen it, some of the impact of all that, of petrol sniffing, and in the Aboriginal world, and what happens to a lot of kids, and.
What about the idea of a story that's told entirely by someone who can't speak?
Nothing wrong with that.
No. It is from an editor.
Well, I talked about that in Darwin at the Word Festival up there, and this senior Aboriginal woman, Larrakia woman, came especially to hear me talk, and I'd known her in past years, and she came, and it was difficult. She's not a really well woman, but she came to this event. It was a night event in Darwin, a really lovely, balmy night, and she brought with her her brother's daughter and her brother's daughter's daughter. There's a little girl, and to this event, because she wanted them to hear me talk. And I was really, felt really honoured that she came and touched. But he talked at that event about, I'd had a thought about the Bolivia being mute in the book, and about that time, and I thought I should have made everybody mute in the book. And I said, wouldn't that have been a challenge? I mean, it was a challenge enough, with Olivia, but and people feel challenged because the main character is mute. But wouldn't that have been, that would have been even a bigger challenge to make everybody mute. And anyway, Kathy afterwards, the lady after the show, and she had to go because she's like I said, she was a well woman, and it was a bit uncomfortable for her to be there, and she said, Jess, she said, I really like what you said. She said, yes, there's some people they should just shut the fuck up. Yeah.
And at what point do the names come? I mean, your names are always extraordinary, like Angel Day, Oblivia, Etheline, with all its parentheses and its brackets, and Lady Belladonna of the Champions. Where do they come from?
I think we're quite good at making up names for people. Well,
the names were made up for you, like boot polish and so on, in colonial times.
Yeah. We seem, I don't know, but maybe it's the circles I've moved in, in that sort of Aboriginal political circles that I've moved in for a long time. Names are, and a lot of people do get names, call names in the Aboriginal world, like Side Saddle or
Tracker.
Yeah, Tracker. He calls me Righty, and tend to call people each other names, and sometimes it makes sense, if the someone dies and you can't use your name, if it's Peter or David and a lot of children and now get given these incredible names. I don't know where people get them from, but it's because of that. If someone dies,
the prohibition.
Yeah, the prohibition, and it just seems to be easy to call someone Blue or I just can't recall some of the names that I've heard over the years, but people get cool names, and I don't know. I just you got to have fun. What you're doing, and Tracker would say this. Who I'm doing this project with, there's no sense of doing things. If you can't have fun doing it,
right. So
and enjoying it,
yeah.
and so the names come. And
there's a kind of celebration of the process.
Yeah.
Even though the things that happen to them may be terrible, nevertheless, there's a kind of joy in the actual creative process, making these people come alive.
Yeah. And
an exuberance, really.
Yeah.
Vitality.
Yeah. Angel Day, and these names just come to you. Odd times. So usually when I'm most relaxed, and that's not often. And so if I'm really and I could be walking, walking the dog or something, and the name will come like I just walk in the streets in Alice Springs, and Mozzie Fishman came to me, for instance, and he has to go in the book. He had no part in the book. He had no part in that story at all.
And he had no character either. The name came first.
Yes, and I had this image of or what he was like, and that was his name. And I thought that's a great name. So he's going in the book, and
so it's interesting
and the Harbour Master.
He's a bit like a Mozzie, isn't he? He keeps kind of reappearing and annoying people and so on.
Yeah.
Right across the territory.
And
then on the other hand, he's Mozzie.
And there are people like that.
Moses, and he is a kind of Moses figure. So there are kind of symbolic tentacles on these names, but they just come into your head.
Yeah. And Mozzie Fishman was he's a religious zealot in the Aboriginal law world, and there are people like that. But they all got names, and people have these incredible names, and so that was his name. But they just come out. I don't know where Bolivia came from, but it's part of that, that whole total character of her of being invisible and not being important in anybody's world, and. So, she's oblivion. She's oblivious.
There was a character in this one book called Mechanic or Machine. Actually, I think you called him Machine. He was the perfect servant. He was the guardian of Warren Finch's castle, the tower where his princess, Oblivia, was imprisoned. And he was like Cerberus or the monster. The robotic monster who guards the fairy princess.
Yeah.
And so you called him Machine, which seemed appropriate. But at some point you decided he wasn't Machine, he was Mechanic. Or it was the other way around. So we had to change them all.
Maybe you confused me.
Yeah. but the rejected name still featured in the blurb because I read Mechanic so often that so that was an interesting kind of shift. Obviously you had the conception there, the name could move around a bit. I remember with Normal Phantom, I wondered whether he should be Norman. In Capricornia, it's Norman. In your book, it's Normal. So there's a kind of shifting around going, which is really interesting. But what about the hybrid characters and, like the Harbour Master, who's part Asian, part Aboriginal, and he's a harbour master whose seat is on a sand dune. Looking after a lagoon that's completely sanded up, so that's fun. But he's got a monkey on his shoulder called Rigoletto.
Yeah. Eric Allaire is great.
Yeah, who ends up on top of the tower of the cathedral in Melbourne. Yeah, like the Phantom of the Opera, kind of haunting the cathedral.
Yeah.
So there are these sort of mixtures. Where do they come from? I mean, they come from different sources. You don't seem to mind, or you seem to rejoice in bringing together material from different sources.
Yeah, well, particularly with the this Swan book with Carpentaria, I really wanted it to be faithful to just about every, inch of the Gulf of Carpentaria. For I wanted it to honour something, and from my home territory, and I was very, very concerned that it was authentic in every way, the way people spoke and the way they looked, and what the country was like, and how people felt, and so that was really, really important to me with that particular book. With the Swan book, it's a different book, different altogether. I think, and but I wanted it to be broader still. You say it was all encompassing and broad and Carpentaria, but I wanted to capture something even more in the Swan book, and because what happens a lot in our world too is people like to position us and contain us, put us in some box or something, and and then when they put the people in, put us in a box about this or that, then I don't like what's in the box, and they don't like this, and this is too mundane, this is not right, and try and change the box and whatever, and it was a bit like that about Aboriginal writing as well, oh, you must write like a white person, and so people attempt to write and tell stories and that. Oh no, we don't like that, and it's so. I do want to shock and say, we if you think you know everything about Aboriginal people, well, look at this, and that's the Carpentaria as well, and right in the front, about we already know your story, and a little piece up top, whatever it was, about the tabernacle, and so I'm just trying to broaden it, and as something that it's embracing the whole world, because we do we're a part of the world. We're not just part of your construct of what the Aboriginal person is, and we belong to this whole world, and it's bigger. It's not just us in a box and then everybody else in this bigger box called Australia. We belong to the planet. And
it's very striking in the Swan book that Olivia has a fairy godfather and a fairy godmother, or if you like, two tutelary deities, and one is half Asian and the other is Eastern European. So I think significant as an Indigenous writer, you've really gone out of your way to be inclusive, and that applies to Carpentaria as well, where Elias, this kind of white, very white spirit comes into the country. So that's part of the inclusiveness, presumably. I mean, it also relates to your own background, to the Chinese and Irish elements in your background. So, how conscious is that on your part to be inclusive in that cultural sense?
Well, it's nothing to do, with identity politics or anything. I don't play along with that. I see that happening a lot, and that's also in Australia. with in the creating of boxes and putting people, into little positions, and you stand in that corner and that corner, and I always, are you black enough, and all those politics and race politics, who's the, Aboriginal or not Aboriginal. I don't play into that because that's nothing, that doesn't come from inside. It comes from outside to try and distract us. And so that's really got nothing to do with it, really. What I'm trying to write. It's not a conscious thing, and on my part, it might be a subconscious thing, but it's certainly not a conscious thing to put it there.
But it does lead you into controversial waters, I think, not just in terms of identity politics, but in terms of Indigenous politics. So I would have thought in the Swan book, the fact that you've chosen to show an Indigenous president of Australia in an unflattering light, as a failure, in fact, would also be seen as, in some sense, or could be seen as a betrayal of the strict notion of your responsibility to the Indigenous ideal.
That would be an Indigenous ideal, I don't think, to have an Aboriginal president of Australia.
There's not a good person in it, is there?
Well, it's in terms of how I think anyway. That wouldn't be the major goal. That would in the Aboriginal world.
But it's a brave act to portray an Indigenous leader as wanting, as a failure for his people.
Yeah.
Especially when there were...
I think my concern was more about that expectation again about what an Aboriginal person, should be, and the trap that you can fall into of, saying, I've got to be like this, I've got to become more assimilated or whatever, and to be liked and to be accepted, and that it happens quite a lot here. Yes, you're a good Aboriginal if you, kind of look like,
You're meant to.
Yeah, if you look like what we want you to be, and but the trouble is, it's never. If you strive for that, it's never enough. And I've seen that happen quite a lot. It's just, we used to joke about it, that that you'd see, white men with egos, really falling over a black man in a suit. That's what they love most of all, to see a black man in a suit. And it's great. And he's a success. He's fantastic. And so we see that quite a lot. I'm not mentioning any names here. And
even if they have the same name as Warren Finch. Sorry.
Yeah. And well, if you're talking about John Mundine. Warren Mundine. Yeah, Warren. But Warren Mundine didn't really feature in 2002, 2003 when this book was being conceived, and nor did The Intervention. Came in 2007, and in those early notes, I already had police, army-controlled Aboriginal communities, and that's what happened in 2007 when Howard introduced The Intervention. But nobody would have conceived that back then, and but things were pretty grim in our world. But for some reason or other, I thought in this novel there would be, Aboriginal, army-controlled Aboriginal communities, and and Warren Finch was really nothing to do with Warren Mundine, but there's a lot of people who are in that sort of game in politics, apart from Warren Mundine, and one way or another, wherever he's going, I don't know, and but Warren Finch is another sort of construct. but he's a construct of ideas of what happens to people, who can play that game. Sure, there's some people who are, successful in what they do, but we've also seen a lot of failures too. And in the Aboriginal world, they were seen as failures. They haven't really produced anything of any consequence for us. And I just wanted to show, well, we're aware of this, and when I say making a mark of a time, that's these are some of the things that we've been thinking about and or we know about, and this is what could happen, so you can play along and say, yes, we want the white, the Aboriginal man in a suit, and that's good, but he may not be what you really want, and it usually turns out that way.
Can I come back to the Jack in the Box idea? Because sorry, not the Jack in the Box. The idea of
Containment.
Breaking out of the box, because there is a Jack in the Box element in your writing, kind of sudden, unexpected bursting out. At those council meetings that you describe, it's quite literally a Jack in the Box. Somebody suddenly leap up like that, out of nowhere. But elsewhere, and I think Rigoletto, the monkey, kind of suddenly appears like a Jack in the Box too. So it's quite literal, that idea. It's also very comic, because when it happens, it's unexpected and it's funny. We should open it up for people to ask questions, I think. But it does seem to me that you are a comic novelist, even when the point is extremely serious.
Well, there's a lot of humour in the Aboriginal world, and a lot of things that we do is done with a lot of humour. In dealing with some of the really big political crises that we deal with, or issues and the effect. We will still laugh at ourselves. We'll laugh at other people, and so. Maybe I've learnt that along the way. I don't know, but in writing, when you sit there, day in, day out, for year after year, to produce, a book, you can easily press delete, and get on with life and do something else. But if you're going to sit there, you may as well have fun. And so, and that's what I try to do, because otherwise I could be out having fun with some other people, and so I'm having fun with some of these characters that I'm living with, and and I try to create them as people that I could probably get along with, and that I can have a.
It goes deeper than that, I think, because. Especially in the Swan book, where the landscape is stark, and ravaged, and you've got this massive population movement, from the south to the north, across a barren landscape. And some of the reviews of the book did talk about it as in those terms, as being dark, not dark, but stark, unrelenting, pessimistic even.
What do they think going to happen with climate change?
I don't think it's going to happen.
Huh?
They don't think it's going to happen. Anyway. But it's punctuated. Even the dreariest, the most unrelenting parts are punctuated. So, for example, Warren Finch, his body being transported around Australia, a bit like Kennedy's body was across the United States after his assassination. But because it's such a high temperature, he has to be transported in a Woolworths. What do you call them?
Good food bag.
Huh?
Yeah,
and it's called the Fresh Food People. We could get a libel. We could get some kind of legal notice from them sometime. But anyway, we'll risk it. But it's that kind of thing. And then the whole kind of farce. Farce, I think, is the form of comedy that you're really best at, where everything goes completely haywire. And so the body starts decomposing and the truck driver gets pissed off and, it's just chaos.
Yeah. So that's reality. That's what happens. And your life is, there's a lot of fun in life, and people, can see the funny side of all situations, and yeah.
It's a bit like, it's also slapstick and like the inhabitants of Swan Lake, which is what the lagoon is called.
Yeah.
Nice irony. All they want to do is eat their fried fish, but Warren Finch is carrying on in the council chamber. So they keep raising the fish to their mouth and then having to put it back down on the plate and raising it, putting it down, raising it, putting it down. It's a kind of low, broad, kind of popular sort of comedy that you engage in there. Knockabout comedy.
Yeah, I never described it at all before, but well, perhaps it is. But really, it's just I don't know, just trying to have create a situation that's or a scene that that has funny sides to it, because that's what happens in life. That when you look at it, it's absurd what people will do, and we see it all the time, and that's just part of just what happens. But it's also a weapon in a way, because it keeps you going, and that you can't. You can overcome a lot of things if you can, just see the funny side of something, and as well as the dead seriousness of it, and the seriousness is there, and there's no doubt about that. People don't just be flippant about everything, but we'll just see it for what it is, and a lot of times it's just really absurd. What happens, and in fiction, I probably take it a step or two further, if I possibly can, and as I'm sitting there writing, and then I will change. I'm working all the time, and reworking, and then I get to the point of view, and I just think, well, this is just totally mad. And so let's describe it as mad as it really is.
Push it.
Yeah, and just push it.
You push it.
And
can I just ask you, in all the storytelling that you've been party to in different roles, presumably that kind of comedy appears in those stories. Your grandmother's stories, were they funny?
It's a long time ago. Yeah, it's a long time ago.
But presumably there is a comic element in the storytelling.
Yeah, there is. And if I go,
not just you.
If I go home and I talk to any family members, there's always, people are always laughing all the time, and they're laughing about each other or other people, or something that happened, and it could be terrible. I got bitten by a snake, and that's pretty terrible, and I nearly died, and I've lived, and then they tell the story about well, how stupid it was, to be bitten by the snake, and the snake did this and the snake did that, and and it's quite hilarious, really.
With the embroidering.
And they embroidered a big story around it, and so that's virtually what you're doing.
Yeah.
You're embroidering.
So it's part
story.
of that scale, I think.
Yeah.
The large scale from small beginnings, that's inherently comic too. That disproportion.
Yeah.